most perfect example of instant karma happening in real time. Story 1. A few years ago, I witnessed some instant karma at a gas station that still makes me smile to this day. It was a busy afternoon, and I had just pulled up to fill up my car when I saw a guy in a brand new sports car speed into a parking spot. He revved the engine obnoxiously, clearly trying to show off in front of everyone. He got out, walked to the convenience store, and didn't even bother to lock his car. As he was walking inside, an older man in a beat-up van parked next to him and got out slowly. The van owner, a guy who looked like he hadn't seen a new car in years, calmly walked to the store with a slight smile. A minute later, I saw the guy in the sports car come running out of the store, his face drained of color. He was screaming for someone to call the cops. Turns out the older man had walked over to the sports car, grabbed a metal rod from his van, and proceeded to smash the front grille. No words. Just a couple of heavy strikes, and the guy was left standing there in shock. The best part? The sports car had barely been in the parking lot for 5 minutes, while the old man had spent years saving for that dented van and felt absolutely no remorse. Instant karma at its finest. Story 2. A few months ago, I was in line at a coffee shop, and a woman in front of me was having a full-on meltdown because the barista was taking too long. She was muttering loudly about how incompetent the staff was and how this place was going downhill. The whole time she kept complaining about how ridiculous it was that her coffee was taking so long to prepare, and how she should have gone somewhere else. A few seconds later, the woman's phone rang. She answered it and immediately went silent. You could see the shock on her face as she tried to process what was happening on the other end. She suddenly looked up, completely pale, and asked the barista for her coffee with a quiver in her voice. Turns out, she had just received a call that her car had been towed. The irony was too much for all of us. She was so busy berating the coffee shop staff for something trivial, and she completely missed the fact that she was about to have a much worse day with a hefty tow fee. Story 3. A few years ago, I had a coworker who was notorious for cutting people off in the parking lot. This guy would race through the lot, speeding to grab the best spot and bumping people out of the way. One day, I saw him cutting through a line of parked cars to get ahead. He was driving way too fast for the small lot. As he zoomed by, his car screeched to a halt and he jumped out, looking panicked. I noticed what had happened just a split second earlier. The guy had been so busy speeding past that he hadn't noticed a tiny shopping cart sitting right in front of him. It was too late. His car had rolled right into the cart. It didn't seem like a big deal at first, but as he tried to back up, his front tire got stuck in the wheel. He had to call for help. I couldn't help but laugh as he struggled for a solid 10 minutes trying to free his car, while the rest of us just stood there, silently enjoying the perfect moment of karma. Story 4. A while back, I was walking to my car when I saw a guy in an SUV throw his garbage out of the window. It wasn't just a small wrapper. He threw an entire fast food bag and a cup onto the ground. The nerve of him. I was fuming. And before I could even take out my phone to record the moment, he sped off, thinking he'd gotten away with it. I wasn't having it, though. I went to the trash can, grabbed the garbage he threw out, and placed it right in front of the driver's side door of his car. I snapped a quick photo to make sure I remembered the moment. Fast forward about 20 minutes, and I see the same guy walking back to his SUV. As soon as he got to his car, he froze, stared at the garbage I'd placed, and started looking around, realizing someone had called him out. He looked around, but no one spoke up. He just sheepishly got in his car and drove off. That was the moment when I realized that sometimes karma needs a little help, and I was more than happy to deliver it. Story 5. I work in customer service, so I see my fair share of rude customers, but there was one who stands out above the rest. This woman came in one afternoon, furious that we didn't have a product she wanted in stock. She proceeded to yell at me, telling me that I was incompetent and that the company was a joke. She was making a huge scene, attracting a crowd of people, all while I calmly explained the situation. She wasn't having it. What happened next? She turned to walk out of the store in her high heels, her face twisted in anger, only to trip and fall face first onto the floor. As if that wasn't bad enough, she somehow managed to get her heel stuck in the door as she tried to pull herself up, causing the door to swing shut and knock her over again. I stood there, trying not to laugh, and heard her let out a frustrated scream. Karma truly does have a way of knocking people down when they least expect it. Story 6. I'll never forget the time I saw instant karma unfold right in front of me at an airport. I was waiting for my flight, minding my own business, when I noticed a man in his mid-40s wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase, acting like he owned the place. He walked up to the gate, and instead of standing in line like everyone else, he pushed his way to the front, clearly in a rush to board. People gave him dirty looks, but he didn't seem to care at all. The gate agent, who was polite but clearly annoyed, tried to keep him in line, but he brushed her off, muttering something about his important meeting. Everyone just sighed, knowing this wasn't going to end well. Sure enough, the moment the gate agent called for first-class passengers to board, the guy bolted to the door and was almost halfway down the jet bridge when the agent spoke up on the intercom. She announced, "Mr. Smith, I'm sorry, but your first-class seat has just been rebooked. You've been moved to the back of the plane in economy." The guy turned red in the face, but there was nothing he could do. The agent had made it clear that he had lost his privilege, and the other passengers snickered as he walked to the back of the plane. His arrogance got him nowhere. Instant karma in real time, and it was beautiful. Story 7. A few months ago, I witnessed a moment of instant karma that made me question how much the universe is watching over us. I was sitting at a coffee shop when I saw a man pull up in a sleek luxury car. He was obviously a bit full of himself. He parked the car, took his time checking himself out in the rearview mirror, and then strutted into the cafe with his sunglasses still on. He seemed to have that "I'm better than you" attitude, and it was irritating. He ordered his coffee and stood by the counter, looking around like he was waiting for someone to admire his car. After a while, he stepped outside to check on, clearly expecting to see people admiring his ride. But as he walked back to his car, his eyes widened in horror. In his absence, some kids had parked their bicycles right next to it. It wasn't even a big deal. They hadn't scratched the car or anything, but the fact that they'd been so careless made him fume. He started yelling at the kids, telling them to move their bikes, calling them rude and disrespectful. The universe wasn't done with him, though. As he turned back to his car to open the door, a gust of wind slammed it into the bike rack. The sudden impact left a massive dent right on the door, and the guy stood there, staring at it in disbelief. He tried to make sense of it, but I could see the realization hit him. He was yelling at kids for no reason, and the universe had just given him a lesson in humility. The other customers inside, including myself, couldn't hold back our laughter. Story 8. A few years ago, I had an unforgettable encounter with instant karma while waiting for a bus. It was a typical morning rush hour, and everyone was crowding around the bus stop, anxiously checking their phones. Suddenly, a man in a suit, probably in his late 30s, walked up and, without any hesitation, cut in front of everyone else, claiming that he had important meetings to get to. He was so rude about it, too. He looked at the rest of us with complete disdain, as though we were inconveniencing him just by being there. He wasn't even subtle about it. He was loud, brash, and made sure everyone knew how much more important he was than the rest of us. He stood there smugly, arms crossed, and as we all exchanged uncomfortable glances, the bus finally pulled up. The doors opened, and the man tried to push forward, but the bus driver immediately held up his hand and said, "Sorry, sir, but I can't let you on." Everyone looked at each other, surprised, as the driver continued, "You cut in line. I'm not allowing that." The man was visibly taken aback, but the driver wasn't backing down. The best part? The rest of us stepped forward, got on the bus and filled the seats, while the rude guy stood there, flustered and staring at his reflection in the bus window. He was forced to wait for the next one. Instant karma was real, and it was so satisfying. Story 9. Last summer, I was sitting at a park reading a book when I saw a man walking his dog. It was a beautiful day, and the park was full of people enjoying the sunshine. However, this guy was not one of the people enhancing the day. He was clearly annoyed by his dog, a medium-sized lab mix that seemed to be pulling at the leash. The man started yelling at the dog, calling it stupid and dragging it roughly by the collar. I kept my distance, but I couldn't help feeling sorry for the poor dog, who was clearly just trying to enjoy the walk. The man's attitude toward the animal was unsettling, but I couldn't do anything without making a scene. Then came the twist. Out of nowhere, the dog, fed up with the abuse, yanked the leash so hard that the man was pulled off balance. The dog ran ahead, dragging the man behind, who was now stumbling over his own feet. It was incredible. The guy was trying to yell at the dog to slow down while struggling to stay on his feet. It didn't end there. The dog darted straight for the nearest tree, and as the man tried to hold the leash, he tripped over a patch of grass, falling flat on his face. Meanwhile, the dog was wagging its tail, completely oblivious to the chaos it had just caused. As the guy lay there, I could see that the universe had delivered a swift and fitting punishment for his mistreatment of the animal. Story 10. A while ago, I witnessed a moment of instant karma that made me rethink how much we take our actions for granted. I was at a grocery store waiting in line to pay when I noticed a man ahead of me aggressively arguing with the cashier. The man was complaining about the price of a pack of gum, saying that the store was ripping him off and that he wouldn't pay until they fixed the mistake. His voice was getting louder and louder, and he was causing a scene, trying to intimidate the cashier into giving him a discount. He had no patience, no consideration, and no care for how his actions were affecting the employees. The cashier was calm, but clearly uncomfortable, and after a few moments of escalating tension, the manager came over to resolve the situation. However, as soon as the manager stepped in, the man tried to storm out in a huff, slamming the door behind him. That's when karma struck. As he pulled the door open, the grocery bag he was carrying caught on the handle, and his entire load of food came tumbling down. Apples, bread, cans, everything fell and scattered across the floor. He froze in disbelief, staring at the mess he had just made. For a second, he stood there awkwardly before realizing that he had to clean up his own mess. The cashier and the manager stood by, silently watching, and the whole store was chuckling under their breath. The guy spent the next 10 minutes picking up the items he had dropped, his arrogance long gone. It was a perfect moment of instant karma that no one in the store would ever forget. Story 11. A few months ago, I had the perfect front row seat to some instant karma that left everyone at the park in stitches. I was sitting on a bench, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of a quiet afternoon when a jogger came sprinting by. He was pushing himself hard, sweat pouring down his face as he zoomed around the park. But what caught my attention wasn't his pace. It was his constant loud commentary to no one in particular. "Come on, keep it up! You're faster than this!" he shouted at himself, while at the same time making sure to tell every passerby how hardcore his run was. The guy was clearly trying to project an air of superiority, as if everyone around him was there to witness his amazing athletic prowess. As he passed a group of elderly folk sitting on a bench, he made sure to boast, "I'm the fastest guy here, keep up." Just then, the universe delivered its lesson in karma. The man made an aggressive turn around a corner, full of swagger, but didn't notice the water puddle right in front of him. His foot hit the water, causing him to slip and land flat on his back, his arms flailing. The elderly group, who had been silently observing him, burst out laughing. The man was red-faced, but after a moment he laughed too. Karma had spoken, loud and clear. Story 12. This happened during a trip to a theme park, and it's a moment I'll never forget. I was in line for one of the roller coasters when a group of people behind me started getting restless. It was a long wait, but that's just part of the experience at these places. What set these people apart was their constant complaining. The leader of the group, a guy in his late 20s, kept mocking the staff and saying things like, "These rides are way too long. They need to fix this." Every few minutes, he'd roll his eyes and make loud comments about how stupid the whole setup was. I overheard him bragging to his friends about how he'd been on every major roller coaster in the world and how this was going to be so boring. The staff were handling things professionally, but he clearly wasn't interested in any kind of respect. So, when the group finally got to the front of the line, they were told that they wouldn't be able to ride because they hadn't followed the safety guidelines for the ride. Specifically, they hadn't properly secured the loose items they were holding, which could be a hazard. The guy started arguing with the attendant, demanding to be let on, but the attendant calmly refused, repeating the rules. In the end, the group had to leave without getting on the ride, and everyone around us was watching in awkward silence as the guy turned red with embarrassment. The best part? His group quietly mocked him after, and he couldn't even deny he deserved it. Karma had handled that situation for all of us. Story 13. This story comes from a job I had working as a barista in a busy downtown coffee shop. One morning, a customer came in with a scowl on his face. He walked up to the counter, threw his order down with little more than a grunt, and began demanding his drink be made immediately. His tone was condescending, and he was clearly having one of those days where the world owed him something. As I made his order, he continued to complain about the lousy service and how terrible the coffee was at this place. The rest of the customers in the line exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. I finished his drink and handed it to him with a polite smile. He took it, still grumbling about how slow the process was. But as he turned to leave, he made the rookie mistake of walking out the door without looking where he was going. He tripped over a loose tile on the entrance mat and in slow motion spilled the entire coffee all over himself. He froze, his face turning bright red as hot coffee soaked through his clothes. I couldn't help but suppress a smile, and a few other customers stifled their laughter. He made his way back to the counter, now quiet and humble, as I cheerfully offered to get him a fresh one on the house. The best part was that the entire store had witnessed his downfall, and there was no denying that karma had its hand in that. Story 14. I was driving home late one evening when I witnessed a perfect moment of instant karma that involved a reckless driver and an unexpected twist. I was cruising along a highway when I noticed a car speeding far above the limit. The driver was weaving in and out of traffic, aggressively tailgating anyone who wasn't moving fast enough for his taste. He was honking his horn, flashing his headlights, and making a scene as if the road belonged to him. After a few miles of this, he finally got ahead of me and pulled up to the next light. Just as he did, the light turned red, and he slammed on his brakes, coming to a screeching halt. I wasn't sure what happened next, but I heard a loud bang, A truck that had been following him for miles wasn't able to stop in time and rear-ended the man's car. The collision wasn't major, but enough to leave the man's car with a dented bumper. As the two drivers got out of their cars to exchange information, the first driver, who had been speeding, tried to argue that the truck driver was at fault. But the truck driver simply pointed to the man's bumper, which had already been scuffed up from his aggressive driving. The truck driver said, "You should have been paying attention to the road instead of cutting everyone off." The best part? The guy who had been driving like a maniac just stood there, now completely silent and embarrassed. It was a perfect moment of instant karma. Story 15. One of the best examples of instant karma I've ever seen happened during a family vacation at a beach resort. My family was lounging by the pool, enjoying the sunshine, when we saw a man walk by in a crisp white suit. He looked like he was trying to impress everyone, strutting around and making sure everyone noticed his perfectly styled hair and designer sunglasses. He walked up to the pool, got into the water, and immediately started bragging loudly to the people around him about how rich he was. He was talking about his yacht, his mansion, and all of the high society places he frequented. He didn't seem to care about how obnoxious he was being as long as people were listening. Then, without warning, he tried to climb out of the pool to go lounge on a chair. He made the mistake of not paying attention to the slick edge of the pool, and before he could catch himself, he slipped, falling flat on his back and sending a huge splash of water everywhere. His perfectly styled hair was drenched, and his designer sunglasses went flying into the pool. The entire area went silent for a second before someone started laughing, and soon everyone joined in. He tried to regain his composure, but it was clear to everyone that karma had just delivered its message loud and clear. Story 16. A few weeks ago, I was on a road trip when I witnessed a moment of instant karma that left me both laughing and feeling a little bad for the guy. I was driving on a long stretch of highway when I noticed a car speeding aggressively in the left lane. The driver, an older man in a shiny, expensive-looking sedan, was weaving between cars, tailgating, and zooming by at least 20 miles over the speed limit. He seemed completely oblivious to the fact that other drivers were clearly nervous, slowing down to avoid him. Eventually, after about 10 minutes of this reckless driving, the man came up behind a semi-truck, and instead of waiting for a safe moment to pass, he decided to try and squeeze by on the right. As he did, he misjudged the space and ended up clipping the side of the truck's rearview mirror. The mirror shattered, and the truck swerved a little, forcing the man to swerve sharply to the left. In that split second, his car hit a pothole and bounced into the grass alongside the road. The guy tried to regain control, but his car spun out and ended up in the ditch, stuck and completely immobile. As I passed by, I slowed down just enough to see the man, who had somehow escaped unscathed, standing next to his car, looking bewildered. A highway patrol officer had already arrived, shaking his head at the situation. The irony was just too much to handle. His reckless driving had led to his own downfall. Karma had spoken loud and clear. Story 17. I was in the grocery store one evening when I had the unfortunate pleasure of witnessing a woman throw an absolute tantrum over a mistake she made. She had just picked up a few items at the self-checkout counter and was struggling to scan an item. After multiple attempts, the machine repeatedly rejected the barcode. Getting more frustrated by the second, she started hitting the machine, muttering under her breath about how incompetent the store staff was and how she should have just gone to the other location. I watched as the employee approached her, offering to help, but instead of being calm, the woman started raising her voice. She accused the employee of being lazy and not doing their job properly. The staff member, visibly taken aback, explained that sometimes certain barcodes don't scan well, and that was the only reason for the delay. Instead of listening, the woman waved the employee off, saying, "Don't try to cover for your terrible system." But here's where karma came in. As the woman turned to storm out of the store in a huff, she accidentally bumped into a shelf with her cart, knocking over several cans. As they tumbled down, one hit her right on the foot, sending her hopping around the aisle, cursing. To make matters worse, the woman bent down to pick up the cans, only to knock her purse off the counter, spilling all her contents onto the floor. By the time she left, flustered and defeated, the store was filled with a mix of sympathy and silent chuckles. Karma was swift, and it wasn't kind. Story 18. A friend of mine and I were hiking in the mountains last summer, taking in the stunning views and enjoying the cool breeze. The trail was relatively quiet, and we had just reached a scenic overlook when we noticed a man coming down the trail with a large, expensive camera around his neck. He had a few hiking gear brands on his backpack and seemed to be in a hurry, so we stepped aside to let him pass. Without even acknowledging us, he grumbled, "Move out of the way. Can't you see I'm trying to get to the perfect shot?" His voice was thick with arrogance, as though we were the ones in his way, not the other way around. We exchanged a look and shrugged, choosing to let his rudeness slide, but we couldn't help but shake our heads. He was so focused on trying to capture the perfect shot that he didn't even seem to notice the obvious danger ahead on the trail. A small section with a steep drop if you weren't paying attention. He brushed past us, muttering again under his breath, and before we could say anything, he tripped over a loose rock, landing directly into a small, muddy puddle. His expensive camera went flying out of his hands and splashed into the puddle, completely soaked. The look of horror on his face was priceless. As he stood up, caked in mud, he tried to salvage his camera, but it was already too late. Karma couldn't have been more instant, and it was hard not to feel a bit of satisfaction watching his pride fall along with it. Story 19. I was working at a coffee shop a while ago when a customer walked in who immediately rubbed me the wrong way. He was in his mid-30s, dressed sharply in a suit, and acted like he had better things to do than wait in line for a coffee. As soon as he walked up to the counter, he looked at me with disdain and snapped, "I'll have a latte, extra hot, and make it fast. I don't have all day." I nodded politely, starting to make the drink, but his impatience grew by the second. "What's taking so long?" "I don't have time for this," he muttered, looking at his watch. He was tapping his foot and generally making the entire situation uncomfortable. I was doing my best to stay calm, but it didn't help that he kept eyeing the other customers, muttering about how slow the service was. Finally, I handed him his latte, and he took it without a word, continuing his complaining as he turned to leave. Just as he reached the door, the lid of the cup popped off, splashing the scalding hot latte all over the front of his suit. The man screamed in pain and dropped the cup, clutching at his chest in disbelief. I couldn't help but feel a tiny bit of satisfaction, but as he stood there, staring at his ruined suit, he muttered an apology for his earlier behavior, clearly realizing that karma had caught up to him. He walked out, soaking wet and embarrassed, while the rest of the customers in line exchanged looks, some trying hard not to laugh. Story 20. I was sitting in a small cafe, sipping on my coffee, when I witnessed a perfect moment of karma involving a driver who thought he was too important to follow the rules. It was a busy street with a lot of pedestrians and cars, and as I was watching from the window, I noticed a man in a sleek black car speeding down the street trying to cut through traffic. He had no regard for the crosswalks, honking his horn impatiently and weaving around slower vehicles. The worst part was that he wasn't even trying to avoid pedestrians. He was straight up swerving into crosswalks as if he had some kind of entitlement to the road. He finally came to a stop at a red light, looking smug as ever, probably thinking he had outsmarted the system. But just as he sat there, the light turned green, and as he tried to speed away, he accidentally hit the curb hard and blew a tire. The sound of the pop was deafening. As the man got out of the car, furious and cursing, he realized that not only had he caused his own inconvenience, but he had just blown the very tire he would now have to fix himself. I watched, smirking, as the man awkwardly tried to change the tire, realizing just how quickly karma had caught up to him. Everyone else around the area was in disbelief at how fitting the punishment was. The smugness had vanished, and all that was left was an embarrassed driver and a flat tire. Instant karma at its finest. Story 21. It was a hot summer day, and I was waiting for my friend at a local park. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow on everything around me, and people were enjoying the last few hours of daylight. As I was sitting on a bench, I couldn't help but notice a man in a sharp suit walking briskly around the park, his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking loudly, gesturing dramatically to whoever was on the other end. He clearly wanted everyone to hear about his important business deals and massive profits. His voice echoed across the park, making it impossible to ignore his presence. He passed by a group of teenagers sitting on a bench, laughing and having a good time. As he walked by, he gave them an exaggerated glance, rolling his eyes and muttering, "What a bunch of losers wasting their time in this stupid park." His arrogance was evident, and his attitude toward the group was far from kind. As the man continued on his path, still babbling on his phone, the teenagers stood up and casually walked behind him, snickering. Without warning, the man tripped over an old tree root that was jutting out of the ground. His body jerked forward, and he fell flat on his face, his phone flying out of his hand. The group of teenagers burst out laughing, and I couldn't help but chuckle too. He quickly got up, his face flushed with embarrassment, but the worst part was that as he tried to recover, he accidentally stepped into a patch of mud, splashing it all over his suit. Karma had arrived, and it was swift and satisfying. The once confident man, now covered in mud, looked around, but the group of teenagers was long gone, still laughing in the distance. Story 22. I'll never forget the day I witnessed some of the most fitting instant karma at a grocery store. It was a weekend, so the store was packed with people trying to get their shopping done. I was in the checkout line, watching the chaos unfold around me, when I noticed a woman ahead of me who was visibly frustrated. She was in a hurry, grabbing items off the shelves with urgency and slamming them into her cart as though the world was against her. When it was her turn to check out, She practically tossed her items onto the conveyor belt and began barking orders at the cashier. "I'm late. Just hurry it up," she snapped. As the cashier scanned the items, the woman complained about everything. The price of this, the quality of that, and how the store was too slow for her. She was demanding, rude, and impatient, making everyone around her uncomfortable. But then, as she turned to grab her purse from the side of her cart, she completely missed the fact that her phone was dangling from the edge. The moment she stepped forward, the phone fell onto the floor and slid across the tile, landing right in a puddle of spilled soda from an earlier accident. She didn't even notice at first, continuing her rant about how terrible everything was. However, when she finally reached down to pick it up, her face turned bright red. The screen of her phone was completely cracked, and the soda had seeped into the charging. I couldn't help but grin. The cashier gave me a knowing look, and a few people in line shared a quiet laugh. The woman, now in a full-on panic, was too distracted by the damage to even realize she had been rude to the staff. Her frustration was now entirely directed at her phone. Karma, in the form of a cracked screen, had arrived, and it was poetic justice. Story 23. A few years ago, I had to make a last-minute trip to a popular shopping mall to grab some things for a family gathering. The mall was crowded, and I was doing my best to navigate the aisles when I noticed a man weaving his way through the crowd. He was impatient, almost barging through people and muttering about how slow everyone was moving. He made it clear he wasn't interested in waiting for anyone. He was going to get where he wanted to be, no matter who he had to push aside. At one point, he barged past a woman pushing a stroller, nearly knocking her over. The woman had to grab the stroller quickly to prevent it from toppling, and she shot him a startled look. But the man didn't even acknowledge her, brushing past without an apology. I watched, feeling a little irritated by his behavior, but I didn't think much of it. Until, that is, I saw him rush to the nearest elevator, trying to beat the crowd to the front. As he hit the elevator button, he glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one else was going to get there first. But in his haste, he didn't notice the out-of-order sign above the elevator door. He waited impatiently for a moment before realizing nothing was happening. He looked around and tried to push the button again, still ignoring the people around him who were politely waiting for the working escalator. That's when the moment of karma hit. The elevator doors suddenly opened, revealing an elderly man who had been patiently waiting for the elevator. The rude man tried to rush in, but tripped on the threshold and stumbled into the elderly man, knocking both of them into the floor. The crowd that had gathered gasped, and there was an awkward silence. It wasn't a serious fall, but it was enough to humble the impatient man. He quickly got up, apologized half-heartedly, and scurried off to the escalator. Meanwhile, the elderly man, who had simply waited his turn, stood there, unscathed and still smiling. Karma, it seems, has a sense of humor. Story 24. I was at a busy coffee shop one morning when I witnessed a perfect display of instant karma. It was a rush hour, and the place was packed. People were lined up, ordering their drinks and trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. There was a man in line ahead of me who was acting like he was the busiest person in the world. He was in a hurry, constantly checking his watch and pacing, impatiently tapping his foot. He started making loud comments about how ridiculous it was to wait in line for something as simple as coffee, and how the employees were so slow. Finally, when it was his turn to order, he snapped at the barista. "I don't have time for this. I need my coffee now. Can't you people move faster?" He was rude, arrogant, and demanding, acting as if he was doing the workers a favor by being there. Once he got his coffee, he grabbed it without so much as a thank you and stormed off toward the door. But just as he reached for the door handle, he swung it open too quickly, and the door hit his coffee right out of his hand. The entire cup splashed across the floor, spilling coffee everywhere, and the man stood there, wide-eyed, completely shocked. He looked at the mess, then at the barista, who was now trying not to laugh. The man muttered an expletive, but instead of complaining, he just turned around, walked out, and disappeared into the crowd. Karma had shown up in the form of spilled coffee, and I couldn't help but chuckle under my breath. Story 25. Last year, I was attending a conference at a large hotel when I witnessed a stunning moment of instant karma. It was the lunch break, and the buffet line was packed with people trying to grab food quickly. I was behind a woman who was clearly in a rush, scanning the trays as though she was desperate to grab as much as possible. She was impatiently huffing and puffing, rolling her eyes as she waited for the person in front of her to finish. When the person at the counter didn't move fast enough, she shoved ahead, cutting the line without hesitation. Afterward, she piled up her plate with far more than she could realistically eat and continued to hurry down the line, bumping into people and muttering under her breath. The buffet was crowded, and she barely even acknowledged anyone else's presence as she shoved her way through the crowd. Just as she was about to sit down at a table, though, her stack of food toppled, sending a plate full of salad, pasta, and a drink straight into her lap. The force of the spill startled her so much that she jumped up, splashing even more food onto herself and the table. The room went silent for a moment as people looked over in shock, and then a few chuckles escaped from the crowd. The woman, mortified, stood there, covered in food, with no one around to help her. Karma, with its impeccable timing, had delivered the perfect punishment for her rudeness. Story 26. I was having lunch with my friends at a local diner when we witnessed one of the most perfect examples of instant karma I've ever seen. It was a quiet afternoon, and the diner was nearly empty except for a few patrons scattered around. Our conversation was interrupted when a man in a suit came in, looking frustrated and impatient. He walked up to the counter and started snapping at the waitress, who had just come on shift. His tone was harsh, his words cutting. He was upset that his table wasn't ready, despite the fact that it was still early in the afternoon and the restaurant wasn't busy. The man started complaining loudly, saying things like, "I'm an important person and I don't have time for this nonsense. Do you know who I am?" The waitress, a young woman, tried to calm him down, explaining that it was just a misunderstanding and that she would take care of it right away. But he wouldn't listen. He kept shouting, calling her incompetent, and insisting that he was too good to wait. Finally, he was seated at a table near the window, still muttering to himself. As soon as he sat down, he reached for his phone to make another call, but in his hurry to show off, he knocked over his glass of water. The entire cup spilled onto his lap, soaking him immediately. The man shot up from his chair, his face red with embarrassment, while the waitress, trying to stifle her laugh, hurried over to help him clean up. It was so sweetly ironic. The man who thought he was too important for this world now had his perfectly tailored suit drenched in water, while the waitress, with a genuine smile on her face, kindly helped him. Karma had arrived, and it couldn't have been more satisfying to witness. Story 27. I was at a family barbecue last summer when I saw some of the best instant karma in action. There was a man at the party who wasn't exactly a fan of the outdoors, despite it being a gathering in a beautiful backyard. He kept talking about how much better his house was, how much better his life was, and how he couldn't stand being outside in the dirty air. His comments were patronizing, and he was belittling everyone who was enjoying the simple pleasure of grilling and relaxing in the fresh air. The more he complained, the more insufferable he became. At one point, he got up to grab another drink, and while doing so, he tripped on the edge of a garden hose lying on the ground. He lost his balance, and as he tried to recover, he knocked over the entire barbecue grill. A large portion of food went tumbling into the grass, while the grill, still hot, tipped over and sent embers flying in every direction. He froze, completely stunned, as the guests scrambled to make sure no one was burned. In that moment, the man looked ridiculous. He tried to salvage the situation, but most of the food was ruined, and the grill needed to be put upright again. The rest of the party couldn't help but laugh. Karma had delivered its swift punishment, and the man, who thought he was too good for this humble barbecue, was now the center of everyone's amusement. Story 28. It was a busy morning at the subway station, and the train was delayed for maintenance. A woman in her 30s, wearing a designer coat and a matching handbag, stood at the entrance of the platform, clearly agitated. She kept checking her watch, muttering under her breath about how late she was for a very important meeting. She paced back and forth, growing increasingly impatient. She glanced at the crowd, scanning everyone with disdain, as if to imply that everyone else was the reason for her inconvenience. She loudly complained to no one in particular, saying things like, "I can't believe this. They better get this train moving. I don't have time for this nonsense." The longer the wait went on, the more irritable she became, ignoring the signs that explained the delay and the friendly announcements from the station staff. She even took out her phone and began ranting on social media, tagging the subway company and demanding an explanation. Then, just as the train finally pulled up to the platform, she made a mad dash for the doors. She pushed past people trying to board, completely ignoring everyone else's need to get on. As she tried to squeeze through, she slipped on a wet patch on the platform, losing her balance and falling flat on her back. The entire train platform gasped, and some passengers even stifled laughter. She stood up quickly, embarrassed, and trying to pretend it didn't happen, but her face was as red as her coat. The best part? The train had come, but she had lost her place at the door. She now had to wait for the next one, which was completely packed. Karma had worked its magic, and it had no patience for her rudeness. Story 29. A few weeks ago, I witnessed one of the most ironic moments of instant karma, and it still makes me laugh. It was a sunny afternoon, and I was sitting at a cafe with a friend. As we chatted, I noticed a man sitting alone at the table next to us. He was an older gentleman, dressed in an expensive suit and reading a newspaper. He was quietly sipping his coffee and seemed content. But then, out of nowhere, a group of teenagers walked in, talking loudly and laughing. disturbing the otherwise calm atmosphere. The man shot them a disapproving glance, clearly annoyed by their noise. The teenagers, oblivious to his gaze, continued on with their conversation. And the man, now visibly irritated, grumbled to himself. "I can't stand these kids," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone around to hear. No respect, no manners, just noise everywhere. As the group walked by his table, one of the teenagers accidentally bumped into his chair, causing him to spill his coffee all over his lap. The man immediately jumped up, shocked, as the coffee stained his suit. He stood there for a moment, looking like a deer caught in the headlights, as the teenagers hurriedly apologized and walked out of the cafe, snickering amongst themselves. It was the perfect moment. The man, who had been so critical of the teens, now stood there, soaked in coffee and looking completely flustered. Karma had a way of delivering its message, and in this case, it couldn't have been more fitting. Story 30. A few months ago, I witnessed a bit of instant karma unfold in the most unlikely of places, a busy office building elevator. I was on my way up to a meeting and the elevator was packed with people, all trying to get to different floors. The doors closed, and as the elevator began its ascent, a man stepped on at the last second, just as the doors were about to shut. He was wearing a suit, clearly in a rush, and he immediately started muttering under his breath about how inefficient the elevator was. He was tapping his foot impatiently, sighing dramatically and giving everyone else in the elevator irritated glances. Finally, he snapped, "Can't this thing go any faster? I don't have time for this. What is wrong with this building?" As if on cue, the elevator came to a sudden stop between two floors. The lights flickered and the elevator jolted to a halt. The man's impatience turned into full-blown frustration as he began frantically pressing the buttons. "Come on, move!" he shouted. The rest of us stood in silence, trying to suppress our amusement. The building's intercom crackled to life, and a calm voice announced that the elevator had temporarily malfunctioned and would resume shortly. The man was now red-faced, still fuming about how unprofessional everything was. But the real irony hit when the elevator doors finally opened and he stormed out. As he did, he tripped on the carpet just outside, stumbling and catching himself on the wall. Everyone in the elevator, including me, let out a quiet laugh. Karma had come for him, and it was an incredibly fitting reminder that impatience can often lead to embarrassing outcomes. The man, now thoroughly humbled, quickly walked away, probably hoping no one had noticed his little misstep. Story 31. A couple of years ago, I was attending a wedding reception in a beautiful hall with grand chandeliers and long, elegant tables. It was a wonderful day, filled with laughter, music, and dancing. However, there was one guest who stood out for all the wrong reasons. He was a relative of the bride and seemed to think he was the star of the show. The man, who was probably in his early 40s, had spent the whole evening talking loudly, dominating conversations, and bragging about his wealth and how he was connected in the business world. He had no qualms about making everyone around him uncomfortable with stories about his latest luxury purchases, expensive vacations, and exclusive connections. At one point during the evening, he started loudly mocking the wedding food, claiming it was subpar compared to the meals he had at real restaurants. He scoffed at the simple buffet, saying things like, "If I wanted to eat this trash, I could have stayed at home." Everyone at the table grew quiet, clearly not amused by his rude remarks, but Karma, as always, was ready to intervene. The man, still scoffing, walked toward the buffet to load up his plate with more food. As he reached for a large serving of roast beef, he slipped on a small puddle of sauce that had spilled on the floor. In what felt like slow motion, he lost his balance and crashed into the buffet table. His plate flew from his hands, landing face first into the mashed potatoes, sending the entire spread into chaos. The man stood there, covered in food and utterly mortified. The guests around him, who had been listening to his constant boasting all evening, couldn't help but smile. Some even stifled their laughter. The man, now covered in mashed potatoes and gravy, quietly disappeared to the restroom to clean himself up, while the rest of us enjoyed the rest of the evening, savoring our food with a newfound appreciation. Story 32. I was sitting at a crowded coffee shop one afternoon, trying to finish some work on my laptop. The place was buzzing with energy, the sound of milk frothing and conversations blending together. A man in his late 20s walked in, looking irritated from the moment he stepped through the door. He seemed to have the kind of impatient air about him, as if everyone in the room was slowing him down. He ordered his coffee and then stood by the counter, tapping his foot and glaring at the barista who was making his drink. He didn't speak much, but his body language screamed annoyance. When the barista called out his order, he snatched the coffee and muttered something under his breath about how slow the service was. As he turned to leave, he was so focused on his irritation that he didn't notice the small puddle of water by the door. In his rush to exit, he slipped on the puddle, sending his coffee flying across the room. The hot coffee splashed all over his shirt, soaking him in front of everyone. He froze, completely stunned, his face going from red with frustration to pale with embarrassment. The barista, who had been the target of his earlier complaints, gave him a sympathetic but knowing look. The rest of us, watching the scene unfold, tried to hold back our laughter. He quickly stood up and started apologizing, but his attempt to save face was futile. It was a moment of perfect instant karma, and everyone in the coffee shop saw it. The man slunk out of the door, embarrassed and soaked, while the rest of us couldn't help but chuckle under our breath at how quickly karma had taken its toll. Story 33. A few years ago, I was at a local bookstore, browsing the shelves in search of a new read when I noticed a couple in the fiction section. They were standing next to a bookshelf, loudly discussing the best books ever written. The man, who was in his mid-30s, was spouting off his opinions with complete confidence. He was naming the most obscure literary classics and speaking about them with such arrogance that it became clear he was trying to impress everyone around him. He loudly stated, "Anyone who doesn't read these books is obviously just following trends. You people wouldn't understand quality literature if it slapped you in the face." He continued on with his smug commentary, not noticing the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of other customers around him. It was clear that he was more interested in showing off than in actually discussing literature. Then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, he grabbed a book off the shelf, turned to flip through it, and suddenly tripped over his own feet. The book slipped from his hand and flew across the aisle, landing in a nearby stack of other books, knocking them all over. The entire bookstore went silent for a moment, and then the man, red-faced and flustered, bent down to pick up the mess he had caused. The worst part? He accidentally stepped on the corner of another book, sending it flying out of his reach. The customers around him exchanged knowing glances, and I could barely contain my smile. The man, who had been so certain of his intellectual superiority, was now the laughingstock of the store. His attempt to impress had backfired spectacularly. Karma had definitely made its presence known. Story 34. Last summer, I was at a small neighborhood restaurant when I witnessed one of the most poetic moments of instant karma. It was a quiet evening, and the restaurant was nearly full. A couple walked in and was seated at a table near me. They were clearly not in a good mood. The woman immediately started complaining about the temperature in the restaurant, saying that it was freezing and asking the waiter to turn up the heat. She loudly insisted that the staff should get their act together and make sure the place was more comfortable for their high standards. As they looked over the menu, the man began making rude comments about the prices. "I can't believe I'm paying this much for a salad," he muttered, clearly displeased with the cost. He wasn't holding back, making sure that everyone within earshot knew how dissatisfied he was with the place. When their food arrived, the woman didn't even thank the waiter. She just pushed her plate aside, claiming that it looked nothing like the picture on the menu. Her complaint echoed through the room, drawing attention from other diners. She demanded that the dish be remade, while the man continued to grumble about how awful everything was. And that's when it happened. In the midst of her complaints, she tried to take a sip from her glass of wine but missed her mouth and spilled the entire glass on her lap. The red wine splashed all over her clothes, staining them immediately. She froze, her face turning a bright shade of crimson as everyone around her silently watched. The man stood up to help, but his face said it all. He was just as embarrassed. It was the perfect moment of karma. The woman, who had been so vocal in her dissatisfaction, was now the one who had to deal with the mess she had made, literally. The rest of the restaurant went back to its usual buzz, but a few customers exchanged knowing glances. It was a moment of cosmic payback that couldn't have been more fitting. Story 35. I was at the airport last year, waiting for my flight when I witnessed a moment of instant karma that made me believe in fate. I was sitting at a gate with a few other travelers when a man walked by, clearly in a hurry. He was pushing through the crowd, jostling people aside with an attitude that screamed impatience. He was on the phone, talking loudly about how much more important he was than anyone else in the terminal. His conversation was filled with name-dropping and complaints about how his busy schedule was keeping him from getting the VIP treatment he deserved. As he walked by, he muttered, "These people don't know how to hurry up. I don't have time for this." He was so wrapped up in himself that he didn't even see the row of chairs ahead. Just as he reached them, he tripped on one of the legs and fell forward, crashing into a woman's bag. She yelped in surprise, and the man, looking absolutely shocked, scrambled to his feet, apologizing profusely. The best part? As he tried to stand, he lost his balance again and fell backward into the row of chairs, knocking over a few more bags and causing even more chaos. The woman he had bumped into stood there, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. The man, now covered in embarrassment, stood up slowly and tried to salvage his dignity. But it was clear he had learned a valuable lesson about humility. Karma had come for him in the form of a perfectly timed misstep.